We have to learn from the best practices. But I have to, looking at our situation in South Africa, it's very interesting to learn from you. I was interested in terms of funding. How does your program help those who want to further their studies, especially with the degrees, taking into consideration that they are coming from disadvantaged backgrounds? Do you have any program in place to have funding their education? And the second one is you have also highlighted the challenges that they face when they come into communities. Do you have any program in terms of job placement to minimize those challenges? Because if they do not get any assistance, they will re-offend and go back into the centers. I think that is all from my side.
Thank you. Two very important questions that I omitted in my presentation, so thank you for bringing those up. One is around the question about funding. So, and actually this also raises the question of, I'm actually surprised that the first question I was expecting the question that I get often in a South African context, which is, why should people in prison be having access to higher education when there is a shortage and a crisis around the issue more broadly? So how do we deal with that? And that's actually quite connected to the funding question, because it's about how do we sell this, right, to a public that is going to say, be very punitive in its attitudes, and also say, make that objection, which is a very legitimate objection that I will not, I do not discount the reality of the crisis in terms of access to higher education, period. But I think, so I should say that when I started the program in the US, I started working in prisons about 15 years ago in the US. It was not a popular cause. When I started the prison to college pipeline, I had enormous challenges getting funding. Everyone said to me, again, asking me if I was crazy, why are you giving education to people in prison? You're educating these criminals, they don't deserve education. I heard every bit of naysaying. I continue to hear much of the same naysaying sometimes, a lot less of it. And that's because there's been a radical culture shift, as I was mentioning, where people are now understanding that prisons are the civil rights issue of America's time right now. And so it's a lot easier to get funding. Still never easy. Those of us engaged in fundraising know it's never easy, but it's certainly easier because the issue came to the fore and because the discourse shifted. And so when we started out, I got a small grant from a foundation. I started tiny, 12 students, and now obviously we've multiplied into the hundreds. And we then got support from the Ford Foundation. We then got support from other foundations, which led to, again, the federal funding coming into play. Now we have a contingency plan, because certainly we don't expect the current thing that's in the White House to be supportive of this continuing. So we now got the university to give us tuition waivers, something we never would have expected or asked for in the beginning. So all that is to say, it's a process of sort of slowly building from small, getting the small grants, and then expanding from there, while simultaneously changing the conversation and the culture around this issue so that people can understand, number one, I think more broadly, I am a very overt prison abolitionist. Prisons don't work, they don't make us safer, they're not building communities, they're not doing what we would like them to do or what many people think they do. And so any conversation around that, this has to start with getting a public to understand, why does this matter, why is it important, why does it behoove us all if the people that we're locking up in these dysfunctional places come out better ready to be citizens, more conscious human beings, better and smarter fathers, sons, people, right? All of this is so vastly important. And so it has to go hand in hand with a campaign to the public that sells this, which then opens funding doors, which opens private sector. We've gotten private sector donations. We have a scholarship fund that funds, for instance, our students' trips to the student to South Africa, but also all the various crises that happen. Housing, we've had to fund it all at one point or another, and much of that is from private money, people who've been moved by our students, by the program. And so it's a simultaneous process, I think. I should say that in terms of fundraising efforts here, I've already had conversations with three foundations who are quite keen on the program and keen on it in a South African context. I don't imagine it'll be difficult to find funding, at least to start, because of this being unlike anything that exists, and because I think, again, I feel like given the legacy of UNISA in the prisons, the legacy of education behind bars is nowhere more powerful than in this country, and part of the reason I feel so passionately about it here. So that speaks to the funding issue. Also, in terms of the argument about why this matters so much, I think I hear a lot from corrections officers sometimes in the prison in New York. I walked into the prison one day and a corrections officer had hung up an editorial from a conservative newspaper about, these prisoners getting free education. So there's still backlash and there's still that attitude. And what I say to them, and I've been a resource for many a corrections officer, giving them information, why don't you come back to school? We're happy to involve you in this process. Part of what we're thinking about even with Stellenbosch is bringing some of the warders to Stellenbosch who are interested in degrees. The head of Polesmore actually just approached me, wanted to have dinner to talk about him pursuing a PhD in theology, and might I assist him with some connections, in the Western Cape around that. So you can be a resource to everyone in this environment, but it's also most importantly about kind of breaking down the us and them thinking, the thinking that says, but me first, why them and not me, instead of saying we're all in this together. And certainly given the concern about crime and safety here, and for very good reason, never to minimize that reality, it behooves us all to create safer communities through education. And I think part of that is acknowledging that there are those for whom higher education will have an even deeper impact on society at large, more than other people per se for now. But I also say it's not an either or, it's a both. You can develop access to higher education while simultaneously developing access to higher education for people incarcerated and formerly incarcerated. So it's a joint effort. So that was a very long answer, but I think important in terms of thinking about funding and practicalities. And job placement. The job issue is a constant obstacle course, as is the housing issue. I know it's the same and perhaps amplified even here. So we do have an on-site social worker who works to place our students in jobs. What I think helps most of all, because yes, you are right to say we are under no illusion that higher education can come in and solve all of the practicalities. It cannot. You still need to have food on your table, you need to have a place to live. We work with our students and connecting them to social service agencies that do that work. And the vision is that there are people who do that work here, or trying to do that work here, so they would be deeply involved in this program, in any program like this. So, but the other key factor that's so important in terms of jobs and jobs post-graduation, jobs while people are in school, is the networks and the connections, right? We all know this. What gets you a job? Getting a foot in the door, knowing someone who knows someone. And so I get students jobs, other faculty members get students jobs. We know people who might own a market and are hiring tellers, or another student, we have a student who got a job at one of at Clicks, our version of Clicks, and he's now gotten 4 more students hired. So it's the networks, I think, are the most powerful thing in all of this for advancing, period.
I'm glad that you speak about networks, because as Inside Out, that is basically what we are trying to do, to have a network of people that are working within corrections, but people that are able to help us with such issues as well. And we're trying to build a database. If you've never been on the UNISA, on the Inside Out wiki or on our website, you can go on there and get information with the networks that we have built over the years, the few years that we have been in existence. I'll take one more question from the gentleman, and we will take another round of questions. We'll take one.
Actually, it's not a complete question. It's a comment, contribution in terms of what I've been listening from Dr. Dreisinger. My name is Lazarus Magula. I come from the organization called Science. I'm presently on parole, based on parole. Our civil lives term in prison. I've made this organization with my fellow colleagues from prison. I've started to study in prison from grade 10 until finally my due to conclusion of my degree in law. And I have other colleagues of mine who have completed their studies inside prison. But it was tough. It was not an easy path for us in prison to study until to a magnitude of a degree in prison. Thanks to UNISA and other correctional services, not all. I think it is important, this information that we had, and these important people are having started here to try and integrate in terms of giving some information or educating, firstly, the denialism of officials in correctional services that are against education. That must, because if you're an inmate, when you started now being in a degree 4 level, now you tend to get this resistance or a negative attitude. There is no encouragement or desire to see offenders attain whatever they have to attain in order to change their life to the better into the society. There's a minister, the predecessor of this one, or of this current one, which was Mr. Smith. He tried an initiative to make education compulsory in prison, but he had hiccups with his colleagues or whoever, those have impact in them that make them not to be possible. Because education in prison is a key. If the mindset of a person who's idling is a devil battleground. If a mindset of a person who's being locked in a closed-knit community and doing nothing, that to empower the knowledge, because knowledge is power. Because without knowledge, nothing can happen in one's life. And even if, when we have to go outside, there it is, we want to get a challenge. I've got colleagues as well who are competent. But once they are here outside, there is a challenge. Simply that is I'm going to face in the near future, because I'm in my fourth level. After completing, I have to serve my articles. After serving articles, I have to go and apply for admittance to practice in a law society. That is where I'm going to get a stamping for because of my previous record. Then I felt it was a wasteful exercise for me to be studying inside prison and attaining this to change my life. That's where recidivism, doctor, started. Because when a man cannot fend for himself or for a family and knows nothing other than crime and attain education, that's where you take a simpler route of real committing crime. Because correctional service, when they in the process of reconsideration of power, they don't plan appropriately where to give a person an opportunity that to be prepared for life outside. We are only throwing lions there just to see for yourself, because your time is now arrived to go home. Now you can see for yourself outside what you can do. That's the danger lies. That's the comment that I wanted to make.
Thank you. Of course, that's a tremendous amount of wisdom, and thank you for sharing it. Around the legal issue, I was at WITS yesterday at the Center for Applied Legal Studies, and this came up as well, this issue of not being able to practice if you have a criminal history. And as I mentioned, in the US, you are technically allowed, but they can deny you. You can go through your entire law training, and then they will just at the very last stage, after you've taken the loans, after you've done all of the work, tell you, sorry, we have what's called the moral turpitude clause, you're not fit. But there are lots of precedents in recent years of people fighting that and then being admitted to the profession. And one of the things that came up, I think WITS is quite keen on pursuing advocacy around that particular issue here in South Africa. So if anyone is interested, I can connect you, and if you're not already connected with CALS at WITS, then I'm sure I can make that connection. They'd be happy to hear from you.
Thank you, Dr. Dreisinger, for the mindful presentation. But what it gets me thinking more than anything in the South African context is that without me making gross exaggerations at all, So the South African context, most of the kids or most of the people that land up being incarcerated, it's due to households that are impoverished, and we have a white paper that says that. So my biggest concern is usually when ex-offenders come back home, they usually come back to such conditions, similar conditions, because they probably even left siblings behind. And I remember watching one of your presentations where it was about criminalization of poverty. And to me, that's what actually went in my mind, to say a lot of people that are incarcerated are actually doing injustices for a just cause, because they are actually committing criminal offenses to actually fend for their households and all of that, or their siblings. So my biggest concern is, how do we then go back, ensure that education stems or education starts in those households, to make sure that when these ex-offenders come back, they don't come back to a position whereby they actually started at, or started from, whereby they find themselves being unemployed and then faced with a family that still doesn't have bread, like pre-incarceration. How do we tackle that? How do we ensure that it's not a vicious cycle, where probably this ex-offender is going to now be fighting with a younger brother who's probably walking in the same footsteps that he or she is probably walking in. So that's also a biggest challenge that I've actually come up with.
Yeah, I mean, again, so yes, thank you for that. It's a really important concern. And again, I would emphasize that there is no one answer to this question, nor is there one way to do this work. And certainly what you're talking about is all of the preventive measures that go into play in households and in educational communities that prevent one from going to prison in the first place, which is far preferable, of course. And that work has to happen alongside this work. But in terms of, I mean, two things come to mind. One is that the same is true in the US. I have students who've coming back to gangs, coming back to extremely dysfunctional households, where I had a student call me one time. He was locked in his bedroom because his sister, her child's father, had just beaten her to a pulp, and he was afraid to leave the bedroom because he knew what he would do, and that he would clearly go right back to prison, and he had only been home for a month. So, you know, and which is probably the one time that I really felt I was able to talk someone off a ledge to that degree. And so I identify with that struggle. Part of what we do is, I mean, number one is we find alternative housing scenarios so that people don't have to go back and live with their families necessarily for a time. And even if that's a less, it's a, you know, the housing is not as good, so to speak, and it's not as if in America we have the most wonderful housing for people coming home from prison. And New York, of all places, where housing is a nightmare in terms of costs. There are some really awful, what we call, you know, halfway houses, three-quarters houses, but it's better at least in terms of getting them out of a dysfunctional setting. So we look at housing, and we also look at options for, again, the therapy and the trauma and the behavioral stuff that can be all the buttons that are pressed when one is put back in that dysfunctional setting. So how do we address that and work with the students to get there? And then, I mean, clearly the ethos of the program is that we are putting them on a path toward success and moving past that. And I spend a lot of, I mean, it's, you know, it's a very large conversation to have, but I spend a lot of time talking to my students about the value of putting yourself first, at least for now, because they'll have family attachments that are very unhealthy and very, you know, crime-inducing. And so encouraging them to say, it's okay that right now, you know, the best way you're going to one day be able to provide for your family is to be selfish right now and build yourself up. And that's not easy to do. I know that, you know, I mean, like, I'm in the context of this country, which is a very family-oriented country, but I'm working with students who are, you know, especially our Latino students, where family is everything. So to say to someone, put yourself before your family right now, is a dramatic statement, but they learn to do it slowly because they realize in the long run that's what benefits everyone. You're no help to your family if you're in prison again. So it's a big factor. And then the other thing that I think is important is thinking about getting people past the stigma and the importance of language in that. And everywhere, you know, in the US we used to say ex-offender and ex-con, and it's still said, but we don't use, in progressive circles, it's anathema to use that language anymore because for obvious reasons. You're talking about, giving someone a chance and you're still calling them an ex-offender. And you're identifying a person by his or her worst act. And so part of, again, changing the narrative, changing the culture, changing the discourse is as simple as, I often tell this to students when they say, what can I do? I say, stop someone when they say ex-offender, or convict, or offender. And instead talk about incarcerated people, talk about students. There was a moment a few months ago when I was in a prison way upstate, a very, very awful one in upstate New York, and I was sitting outside waiting for my ride, and one of the corrections officers came out and said, oh, are you here to interview for the officer position? And I said, no, I'm not. I'm here doing interviews with students. I'm a professor. And he said, students? What do you mean students? I said, students. He could not. No part of his brain could correlate student with person in prison. And he's not alone. That's true for many people. When I talk about my students, people are not thinking people in prison, but they should be, right? Because that's, it's the greatest minds, that's what Malcolm X always said, right? The greatest minds of our generation are behind bars. I don't think I have to convince anyone in this room of the amount of brilliance that we as a society lose out on. Again, this is why it's about the gifts they bring. It's not liability. It's about wasted genius that we are not, availing ourselves of when we discard an entire segment of the population.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mbongiseni. And I'd like to share a little bit about my study. The topic of my study is how much punishment is enough. Criminal record is death sentence. As you can discern from my title, it's a bit of a metaphor, yet at the same time it's rhetoric, asking a very rhetoric question whether is punishment enough. Surely from what we heard from Professor Bez, punishment is not enough. Punishment is perpetual if you are an ex-offender. I am an ex-offender myself. I spent 10 years in prison. And I'd like to share some of the experiences. First of all, what you said about the Pell Grant, I read quite profusely on the Pell Grant, and I can pick up a few differences. For instance, in the US, when you're using Pell Grant, correct me if I'm wrong, there are certain qualifications that you cannot study towards. Like maybe if you've committed a sexual-related crime, or they said there if it's drug related, you cannot do a particular profession if you've been convicted of those crimes. But the difference with us in South Africa is that we're using NSFAS. Now, I usually say that NSFAS is a one-head-fits-all, because when we apply as an offender, if you are inside a correctional center and you apply to study with NSFAS, no consideration is being taken of the crime that you have committed, because that has got a bearing when you need to practice in the future. I myself, for instance, was supposed to enroll and register as a psychology student, but I couldn't because of the laws that are in place. The same as with Lassie over there. He's doing law and he needs to enroll with the social work council after he's done. In the South African Law Society. There's also others who are doing social work who are also requested to go the same route. But then if the policy does not cater for people with previous criminal records, then it poses a problem. Because now, this is my problem. Muchuzi writes that about 250,000 South Africans are released in every year in a correctional center with a criminal record. So you can imagine if we've got about 250,000 population of people who get released each and every year with a criminal record. That also speaks to the labor force. Because with a criminal record, it's difficult to find employment. As you correctly said, the bend the move movement, where, for instance, in the South African context, we have what we call a Z83 South African government form to apply for employment. There's a section there when you need to disclose whether or not you've got a criminal record. Now, chances are, if you tick that box and say yes, chances are you're not even going to be shortlisted for the job interview. So I think much of the work or bulk of the work lies with us as academics to emulate what you are doing, because as I've read in the US, there's a new discipline called convict criminology. It was not in existence before. Some offenders went to school and then they decided that they're going to come up with this wonderful sort of a program. We do not have that here in South Africa, and I would strongly encourage all of us who are doing work in correction, so that at the end of the day, it should reflect that correctional education has a value at the end of the day. Because now, if you start feeling like Lassie does, that I've studied so much, but then I can't see the returns. What are the benefits of studying if I'm not going to be employed? It means that I'm being judged based on my previous criminal conviction. But what are we saying? Are we saying that those people who've been in prison or who come up with a criminal record, then they are not fit or willing to be part of the labor market? I don't know. This is just me thinking aloud and putting this to the audience. These are some of the issues that we also need to think about, because we're losing such, as we've said, an immense worth of talent that is in prison. We are losing it just because we base people on their previous criminal convictions. Thank you.
Can I ask you, is there any sort of advocacy work currently underway with regard to a ban the box type of thing here in South Africa? Is there anything that's pushing for banning the box and also changing these rules around the laws around what one is permitted to study? I've only ever encountered actually more limits in terms of university, what you're permitted to study as someone who's justice involved in Australia. Australia has some pretty stringent regulations around this too. So is there anything that's doing that now?
Well, not that I'm aware of, but my colleagues can rectify me if I'm wrong. I just met this NGO, this group of ex-offenders about a couple of weeks ago, and one of the conversations that we had, we said that perhaps maybe we can learn from what Zaki Ahmad did. See, in South Africa, there wasn't any provision for people with HIV. Our constitution did not cater for people with HIV.
Yeah.
But then there was this one person, Zaki Ahmad, who represented the Treatment Action Campaign. He took the fight to the constitutional law. Today, as I speak, HIV is included in our constitution as an analogous ground. So we cannot discriminate against a person who is HIV positive. But I can tell you for a fact that criminal record has long been around, but our government continues to ignore the criminal record in terms of including it in the constitution as part of an analogous ground. So that is the movement that we are thinking of creating, just to influence the constitution to also cater and include people with criminal records.
Amazing. That's incredible. That's an incredible vision to do. You were mentioning about Pell eligibility, or our, one of our version of the bursary. In fact, in the U.S., just quickly, prior to 1994, if you were in prison, you were eligible for financial aid and financial assistance so you could study. So there were actually hundreds of university programs in prison in the U.S. And in fact, the very famous Attica Rebellion in the 1970s, that was, very high profile, very connected to the Black Power movement in the U.S. One of their demands was more university access. But 1994 made all people in prison ineligible for financial aid. President Clinton signed this, actually. It was part of an omnibus crime bill. And that actually decimated the university programs, which are now in the process of being slowly rebuilt. So that is a punitive, that was President Clinton's lovely punitive touch to make them. Obama, with the Second Chance Pell Act, was about bringing that back. After years of advocacy that I can't take credit for, these are my predecessors in the movement who pushed and pushed and pushed around access to education and fought this fight to create, to break down these barriers that were preventing people from attaining the education, and they've watched, those successes happen. In the current moment, when you come out of prison, there's actually very few instances where you are not eligible for financial aid. It's one of the great myths and misconceptions among